Carbohydrates will be the first class of biological molecules that we will consider. As shown in the picture, carbohydrates are present in many different foods and contribute significantly to our diet. Carbohydrates are the most abundant of all biological molecules. While they are often referred to as the sugar group, carbohydrates can vary significantly in both their structure and function. What they do all have in common, though, is that all carbohydrates contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, with many of the simple sugars having a general ratio of 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen, or CH2O. This ratio is a bit interesting, as it explains the word carbohydrate. The prefix carbo refers to the element carbon, while hydrate refers to water. So consider the general ratio again, and it is a carbon attached to a water. So the odd name of carbohydrate is reflective of the general ratio that many simple sugars will follow. As carbohydrates range greatly in their complexity, we will consider the 3 main types of carbohydrates: the monosaccharides, or simple sugars, the disaccharides, or double sugars, and the polysaccharides, also known as complex sugars. The simplest carbohydrates are the monosaccharides, or simple sugars. A few examples of foods that include simple sugars include candy, honey, fruits, as well as sodas. Monosaccharides are so named because they are composed of a single sugar that usually only contains about 3 to 7 carbon atoms. These are very tiny sugars and can be used easily for cellular work. Monosaccharides are very important as they serve as a major energy source for cells, as well as functioning as building blocks, or monomers, for more complex molecules. As a fuel source, they represent quick and available energy. But you knew that. Think about when you grab a candy bar to give you that jolt of energy to get you through the day. The simple sugars in the candy bar are easily metabolized by the body. Also, monosaccharides serve as the starting materials for synthesizing more complex molecules. Specific examples of monosaccharides include glucose and fructose. Glucose will especially be important in this course, as we will mention it many times. Consider glucose's molecular formula, C6H12O6. Note that it follows the 1 to 2 to 1 ratio as mentioned earlier. And as a hint, learn that formula now for glucose. You'll be happy that you did. Glucose is a major nutrient for cells and is used in cellular respiration to make ATP, another form of fuel required by the cell. Diabetics must regulate their blood glucose levels, so it's a sugar that we're familiar with. Fructose, or fruit sugar, is most frequently found in fruits and in honey. The disaccharides, or double sugars, are formed as 2 monosaccharides are joined together in a dehydration reaction. Let's consider the illustration below. 2 monosaccharide sugars, in this instance glucose and fructose, are linked together to form sucrose, also known as table sugar. As expected, a water molecule is lost during the reaction. The 2 sugars are covalently bonded to one another via a glycosidic linkage. So yes, it's still a covalent bond and electrons are being shared. Glycosidic just implies that the electron sharing is between 2 simple sugars. It may help to remember that the prefixes GLY and GLU both mean sugar. Other disaccharide examples include maltose or malt sugar, an ingredient used in brewing beer, and lactose, the sugar in milk. You may know someone who is lactose intolerant, meaning then that their body does not produce the enzyme lactase to break down the lactose. Symptoms include gas and cramping, and may be avoided by taking lactase tablets when dairy products are consumed. Polysaccharides, or complex carbohydrates, are huge macromolecules composed of hundreds, if not thousands, of monosaccharides joined by glycosidic linkages. Examples of foods include pasta, bread, potatoes, and rice. And these macromolecules may function as energy storage or as building materials within cells. In particular, we're going to study both starch and cellulose a bit more. Starch represents glucose or energy storage in plants. As a polymer, starch is composed of long chains of glucose molecules covalently bonded together. This illustration shows two types of starch molecules. And while you are not required to know the two different types of starch in the picture, I do want you to recognize that both are composed of the same glucose monomer. The two types of starch just vary a bit in their overall design, one being branched, the other unbranched. The take-home point is that regardless of the type of starch made, glucose is still the basic building block. By synthesizing and storing starch, plants build up an energy reserve that they may tap into later to support cellular work. In particular, plants access the glucose by hydrolyzing the starch, meaning then that a water molecule is added and a glucose monomer is released. Initially, fruits contain starch. Think about green, unripened bananas. However, through the ripening process, plant hormones such as ethylene trigger the conversion of starch into simpler, sweeter tasting sugars. Cellulose is a structural carbohydrate found in plant cell walls. Now, the cell wall is the extra layer found on the outside of the plasma membrane. It helps provide shape and protection to the cell. Like starch, cellulose is a polymer of glucose units held together by glycosidic linkages. Again, let's consider the picture. Notice how cellulose is composed of multiple long chains of glucose monomers that are joined together by hydrogen bonds. Now, as I just said, starch and cellulose both use glucose as their building block. However, the orientation of the glucose varies a bit between the two. So let's take a closer look. As shown here, glucose has two configurations or orientations, the alpha form and the beta form. They differ in the placement of the hydroxyl group, highlighted here in blue on the picture, attached to the number 1 carbon. In starch, all the monomers are in the same orientation. Note the positions of the hydroxyl groups highlighted in yellow are all the same. Now with cellulose, an alternating orientation is evident because every beta glucose monomer is upside down with respect to its neighbor. Again, focus on the yellow highlighted hydroxyl groups to compare with starch, and you see this alternating or flip-flop design. Now what's interesting is the alternating orientation of the glucose monomers in cellulose makes it especially difficult to break down. In fact, almost all animals, including humans, cannot digest cellulose. Rather, the cellulose in our food passes through the digestive tract and is eliminated with feces. Now, while cellulose does not offer any nutritional value to us, it is a source of insoluble fiber in our diets. And so as it passes through the tract, it abrades the intestinal wall, stimulating the production of mucus. And this aids in the passage of food through the tract, preventing constipation. So a diet rich in fiber is important to help maintain a healthy digestive tract. But as I just mentioned, most animals do not produce the enzymes enabling the breakdown of cellulose. So what about all of the herbivores out there? The deer, cattle, horses, rabbits, termites, and so on. How are they able to obtain the nutrients they require if they too are unable to break down much of the plant matter that they consume? Well, herbivores have microbes, microorganisms such as bacteria and protists living in their guts. These organisms hydrolyze or break down the cellulose of hay, grass, and other plant materials and convert the glucose to other compounds that nourish the herbivore. For both the cow and the termite, these microbes are essential to yielding nutrients that would otherwise be unavailable. This is a great example of symbiosis, a relationship between two different species that live together in direct contact. Specifically, this relationship is an example of mutualism, as each species benefits from the interaction. Think of it as a plus-plus relationship. The microbe enjoys a habitat rich with food, and the herbivore gains access to otherwise unavailable nutrients. It's a win-win situation for both.